President Trump seems to be trying to fight back against what he seems to consider Omarosa's most serious accusation against him, that she has heard him using the N-word on tapes made while they were making the TV series The Apprentice, tapes that are in the possession of some people that Omarosa would not name. And so tonight, Donald Trump has tweeted that he got a phone call from the man who owns those tapes, the man who produced that show. The tweet says, Mark Burnett called to say there are no tapes of The Apprentice where I used such a terrible and disgusting word. And joining our discussion now, Michael Steele, former chairman of the Republican National Committee and an MSNBC political analyst, Yamiche Alcindor, the White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour and an MSNBC contributor, and Tim O'Brien, the executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, author of Trump Nation, The Art of Being the Donald, and an MSNBC contributor. And Michael Steele, I want to get your reaction to what the president is tweeting about tonight. He seems to think, or at least what you see in that is the idea that he believes that a tape of him being caught using the N-word could be really damaging to him. What is your reading of what that would actually do to President Trump's standing?
I think if that tape existed, and just as an asterisk on that point, this is a narrative, as you know, Lawrence, that has been around for about 4 or 5 years now, and so it's come from different places and different sources. So there is that, and I think for the president, this idea that if this tape did exist, this did occur, it would be, I think, beyond devastating. To hear the president's own voice, own words, using that word, doesn't matter context, doesn't matter situation. It's going to be hard to come back from that. I think a lot of supporters of his, who, as we've seen, start to move a little bit and shift, particularly around the issue that you raised in your opening, which was very powerful, by the way, this idea of complicit and incompetence. That whole issue with these children, coupled with this type of language coming out of the president's mouth, unlike the Access Hollywood tape, this, I think, has a much more devastating impact.
Yamiche, do you agree on that point? I mean, it strikes me as something that would be, if it existed, completely unsurprising to me, based on my observations of Donald Trump. And we don't have any good evidence that this exists. I don't think any of us are sitting here believing Omarosa on this point. But Yamiche, if it did exist, if it did become public, do you agree with Michael about what the impact would be?
If that tape really did exist, it would be a bombshell for the president. Unlike some other things that have happened to the president, the N-word is steeped in history. People have swung from trees. People have been enslaved. Whole generations of people were denied the right to vote. So much violence was really perpetrated on African Americans using that word, that it's a special place in American history that I think the president would have a hard time coming back from. That said, the Access Hollywood tape, when that came out, everyone was thinking, okay, this is the end of his campaign. Everyone's going to flee from him. He's going to have a really hard time coming back from it. And guess what? He bounced back and became president. So as a White House correspondent, I'm loath to say that there's going to be one thing that would take this president down. That said, Omarosa's claims that she heard him say this have obviously problems, because both of them have credibility issues. And what you have in a reality television president is all these cast of characters that kind of have their personalities and have their own agendas. And for President Trump, because he has his own credibility issues, there's not a way to 100% say, well, Omarosa clearly is wrong and she never heard that and she's 100% wrong, especially because she says that there are going to be other tapes coming out. If she has that tape and it comes out, that could be devastating.
Tim O'Brien, you are, I think, the only one among us who has had conversations with Donald Trump about Omarosa, which we'll get to in a moment. The first thing I want to check with you is something Rachel raised at the beginning of this hour, which is Donald Trump is known to publicly lie about having received phone calls from people that are either praising of him or very helpful to him in some way. And he's done it. We've seen him do it on Twitter, lie on Twitter about having gotten a phone call from someone.
A friend of mine.
Yeah, that was in some way aggrandizing to Donald Trump. What's the possibility? I mean, I guess there is some level of possibility that Mark Burnett has, in fact, not called to say any of this with Donald Trump.
That could be the case. I think, you know, Burnett, during the campaign, when there were rumors about compromising tapes from the set of The Apprentice floating around then, The word was that Burnett put a gag order on former Apprentice producers and staff not to leak anything. So this is consistent with that. I think the larger, what's going on here in part is that you don't have a credible narrator in Omarosa. When Omarosa was kicked off The Apprentice in the early 2000s, she went back and said that one of the contestants used the N-word against her then, and that NBC had edited it out of the show. NBC denied that. And then, even after all of that, she continued to partner with Trump on projects all the way up to the White House. But the reason this has traction is, and Donald Trump just tonight, right before we aired, he tweeted again about Omarosa, and in the same breath said he called himself a true champion of civil rights. He is anything but. Donald Trump is a 72-year-old man who has spent most of his life trafficking in racism and race baiting. He has not been a civil rights champion.
No.
And these issues have our attention through Omarosa because we could believe it to be true, though I don't think we should believe her.
Michael Steele, go ahead.
No, I think that last point is absolutely right. This 72-year-old man suddenly being a champion of civil rights, when you look at his history and certainly his recent history, I mean, he can't even get out in front of Charlottesville and talk to the nation from that championship perspective of civil rights about what this means to the country and why, in particular, African Americans are so repulsed by his reaction to it. So, spare me that particular river. There's no one crying over that one. So let's move on and deal with the fact that right now the president realizes he has a media narrative problem that he needs to get in front of in some kind of way. And this is the part that I find the most ticklish, Lawrence. Trump is talking about this low life in Omarosa. Well, he created this low life. That's like Frankenstein after creating his monster looking and going, well, you're a monster. And he's like, yeah, I mean, I am your creation. So, a lot of this right now is coming up around the president's heels in a way that I think he's being bested to some degree by his own creation. And it is a little bit amusing to watch.
Yamiche, I think one line we're not going to hear in a Trump reelection campaign is, I get the best people, I hire the best people. And this is a crucially important factor when you're looking at this administration's response to the devastation in Puerto Rico, to their own inability to repair the damage that they did themselves on the southern border. Over 500 kids tonight separated from their parents, and this administration has said in court, we don't know how to put those families back together.
Well, I'll say this. I've talked to immigration lawyers who are very, very worried that the parents who were deported without their kids may never be able to be reunited with those kids, or that the United States will drag their feet for years and years, and it might be years of trauma with these children before they see their children again, or their parents again. The thing I'll say, though, is that the White House is still not put out a list of African-American staffers in the White House. So as of right now, it seems as though there's not one black senior staffer in the White House. I've talked to a lot of black Republicans who say that they had people that wanted to work for this White House. Michael Steele has said that Omarosa blocked some of those people from going in, where Ben Carson has decided to raise the rent on a lot of poor people who are looking for federal subsidies. At the DOJ, you have Jeff Sessions looking at ending affirmative action, also looking at possibly extending prison terms. So this is an administration that, if you look at it, they would say that they're champions of civil rights, but people like the NAACP that have called the president outright a racist say that not only in the president's rhetoric, but also in his policies and who he's chosen not to hire, he's shown that he's not interested in civil rights.
Michael Steele, Donald Trump saying triumphantly that Mark Burnett called to say there are no tapes. And there's something about the claiming that there are no tapes so excitedly that gives you the feeling that the person who's so excited that there are no tapes may be worried that there was some possibility
that there are tapes
in the years of that show that there might be a tape.
Yeah, I think that's the case. Look, those sets, people sitting there around talking, and the backstory on these particular tapes in this situation was, there were in between shots, and the president was commenting very openly and very freely. And we know the president does that. We've seen him do that. We've heard him do that, and he's gotten in trouble before in doing that. So I think back in the recesses of his mind, and he's hoping the camera wasn't rolling, but probably believes in the end it was, and that's why you see the kind of concern in the tapes in the tweets that he's putting out right now.
And Tim, it is Donald Trump's case here tonight, as of today, that Omarosa was incompetent. She was completely incompetent, doing a terrible job all the time. He is emphasizing this. He is emphasizing the incompetence within his own administration, and again, shining a light on a book that he doesn't want people to read, and he doesn't want people to believe. We've seen him do this with the other critical.
With the Michael Wolff book.
Michael Wolff book.
Right, and he's also surrounded by people who are duplicit. And he himself is duplicit. And when someone's trying to build a team and they themselves aren't honorable and can't really attract confident, capable people, you end up with everybody backbiting. And that's what you're seeing with this group right now. I think one of the reasons the President of the United States, rather than paying attention to the country's business tonight, thinking about the fact that there's a financial crisis in Turkey, that children are being ripped from their parents at the southern border, he's tweeting about a reality show contestant obsessively all day long because he feels betrayed.
And he doesn't have one person, as far as we know, working in that White House trying to reunite those families that they separated at the southern border. Tim O'Brien, you're Michelle Cinder, and Michael Steele, thank you very much for starting us off tonight. Really appreciate this. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.